I need someone who makes other women jealous, not someone who makes them comfortable, she said during an argument before storming out of my apartment. I let her leave without chasing her. 10 months later, she froze after seeing my engagement photos shared by the same women she once mocked. I need someone who makes other women jealous, not someone who makes them comfortable. She said it the way people say things they've been rehearsing for weeks. Controlled, deliberate, like she'd practiced the line in the mirror until it stopped feeling cruel and started feeling honest. I didn't respond. I was standing near the kitchen counter with a glass of water in my hand, and I just stood there, looking at her. Not in disbelief, not in anger, in recognition, because I'd heard something in those words that cut past the surface, past the sting, all the way down to the real message underneath. She wasn't saying I wasn't enough. She was saying I wasn't visible enough. There's a difference. A quiet, devastating difference. Qley had her coat already on. I hadn't even noticed when she'd grabbed it. That detail bothered me later more than anything else she said, the coat. She'd come into the conversation already prepared to leave. This wasn't an argument that escalated into an exit. This was an exit that used an argument as cover. She waited a moment. I think she expected something. Protest. Pleading. Some version of me asking her to stay, to explain, to give me a chance to be whoever it was she actually wanted. I didn't give her that. I set my glass down. I looked at her, and then I looked away. She left. The door didn't slam. That surprised me. It closed with this soft, deliberate click that somehow felt louder than any slam would have. Like punctuation. Like a period at the end of a sentence that didn't need any more words. I stood in that apartment for a long time after. Not crying. Not spiraling. Just standing. And I thought about something I couldn't have known yet. Couldn't have understood in that moment. Which is that 10 months later, the women she had spent 2 years quietly mocking would be the first ones to share my engagement photos. Would be writing things like "This is everything, and they are absolutely perfect" in comment sections she would eventually find herself scrolling through alone. I didn't know that then, but I think some part of me knew the door closing was the right ending. If you enjoy real stories like this, subscribe, because what happened next changed everything for me. Let me tell you how we got there. Qley and I had been together for almost 3 years when she said those words. 3 years is long enough to stop being casual and become something structural. Her dry cleaning was in my closet. I knew her coffee order by memory and also which baristas she liked and which ones she tolerated. I'd met her parents twice, her grandmother once, her oldest college friends more times than I could count. She had a drawer in my apartment. I had a section of her bathroom cabinet. We had talked about the future. Not vaguely, the way young couples sometimes do, throwing out soft words like eventually and someday. We had talked about it specifically. About neighborhoods. About timelines. About what kind of wedding she'd always imagined and what kind of life I was working toward. I was building something. Quietly, seriously, the way I'd always done things. I worked in operations consulting at a mid-sized firm in Manhattan, and I was good at it. Not flashy good. Methodical good. The kind of good that doesn't generate headlines, but generates trust. I had a solid income, a small investment portfolio I'd started at 26, and plans to eventually move into advisory work or start something of my own. None of this was dramatic. None of it was the kind of thing you'd screenshot and post. But I thought it was the kind of thing that mattered. Qley thought so too. For a while. The shift was gradual enough that I almost missed it. That's the thing about gradual. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. And by the time the accumulation becomes visible, you've already been living inside it for months. What I didn't understand then, but understand clearly now, is that something happened about 6 weeks before that final argument. Something I noticed, registered, and then filed away instead of examining. We were at a rooftop event. A friend of a friend's birthday, the kind of gathering that exists somewhere between social obligation and genuine fun. Qley was in a good mood walking in. Bright. Animated. Wearing the green dress she knew she looked good in. About an hour into the evening, she went quiet. Not the comfortable quiet she sometimes had around people she trusted. A different quiet. Watchful. Almost calculating. I followed her gaze across the rooftop and found what she was looking at, a couple near the far railing. The man was someone I vaguely recognized from some finance-adjacent world. The kind of person who moves through rooms like the room was specifically designed around him. His girlfriend was laughing at something. He had his hand at the small of her back, and every few minutes, someone new would approach them, and the energy around them was magnetic. People kept gravitating toward them. Qley watched this for a long time. I put my hand on her shoulder and said something about getting another drink, and she said sure without looking at me. I didn't realize it then, but that moment changed everything. I should explain Qley more fully, because she wasn't a villain. I want to be accurate about this, not generous and not uncharitable. She was someone who had grown up adjacent to wealth without quite having it, and that proximity had done something particular to her sense of self. She knew the vocabulary of a certain kind of life, the right restaurants, the right brands, the right tone for social settings, but she'd acquired it through observation rather than inheritance, and that gap, that narrow space between knowing and having, seemed to live inside her like a low-grade anxiety she couldn't fully shake. She was smart. She was genuinely funny in the dry, offhand way I'd always appreciated. She was loyal, in her own way, to the people she considered her people. She could be generous. She could also be cutting in ways that she didn't always recognize as cutting. But what she'd always wanted, I came to understand, was for the life she was living to look a certain way to specific people. Not everyone. The right people. The ones whose opinion she carried like a measuring stick. The comparison started showing up in small ways first. She'd mention a coworker's boyfriend who had just booked them a trip to the Maldives. Not bitterly, conversationally, almost, but with a particular weight behind it. A trailing edge. She'd scroll through someone's Instagram story and make a comment under her breath. Of course they went there. Or, she always has to do the most. Said lightly enough that you could laugh it off as casual observation. But it came with a frequency that started to mean something. Then she started making comparisons that included me. Not directly. Qley was never direct when she was dissatisfied. She operated through implication, through questions shaped like curiosity that were actually shaped like criticism. Do you think you'd ever want to do something like that? She'd say, pointing at some influencer couple's video from a yacht in Croatia. Or, Holden's friend just bought that apartment in Tribeca. What floor did you say you were on again? I was on the 7th floor of a solid pre-war building in Astoria. A floor I'd been proud of until I started hearing those questions. Holden noticed before I did. Holden and I had been friends since college. The kind of friend who doesn't perform friendship, who just shows up, who tells you the actual thing instead of the comfortable thing, who will sit in silence with you when silence is what the moment calls for. He'd met Qley early on and been politely warm in the way good friends are when they're not sure yet. After about a year and a half, the politeness had shifted to something more careful. He said it once, plainly, on a Saturday afternoon when we were watching a game. She talks about other people a lot. I said everyone did. He said, not the way she does. I changed the subject. He let me. That was Holden. He'd say the thing once, clearly, and then he'd let you arrive at your own conclusions. He never said I told you so later. He just waited, and when you finally showed up at the door of whatever truth you'd been avoiding, he'd already have coffee made. The comment that should have ended things earlier came about 3 months before it actually did. I'd been out with some work people and came home to find Qley on the phone with her best friend Blakely in the living room. I didn't announce myself. I came in quietly, dropped my keys, started untying my shoes in the entryway. Their voices drifted from the other room. I wasn't eavesdropping. And then I was. She keeps talking about how happy she is with her fiancé, Qley was saying, with a particular flatness in her voice. He's a high school football coach in New Jersey, Blakely. A high school football coach. And she posts like he hung the moon. Like that's a life. Blakely's response was muffled through the phone. I'm sure he's nice, Qley said. That's exactly my point. He's nice. She's nice. They're just content. And somehow that's supposed to be aspirational? I just think you can want more than content. I stood in the entryway for a moment. Then I went to the kitchen and got a glass of water and told myself I'd misread the tone. I hadn't misread anything. But I stayed. The social circle we moved in was the particular kind of upper-middle-class New York-adjacent world where everyone knows everyone's business through 3 or 4 degrees of separation, and gatherings tend to happen in well-appointed apartments or suburban backyards with good wine and pointed conversations. There was a core group of women in Qley's orbit, not all of them close to her, but all of them part of the same social fabric. And within this group, the women Qley was least impressed by were, looking back, the ones I liked most. There was Emery, who had been with her husband for 9 years and talked about him the way people talk about someone they genuinely chose. Not performing the relationship, just inside it. There was a woman named Brooke who came to a few gatherings that summer. Soft-spoken, funny when she got comfortable, recently engaged to someone who ran a small contracting business. Qley made a comment in the car on the way home once. He seems fine. I just expected more from her, I guess. I asked what she meant. She said, she's smart. She could have ended up anywhere. I said, She seems like she ended up somewhere she wanted to be. Qley looked out the window. There was a gathering that fall. A birthday dinner for someone in Qley's extended friend group, held in a Connecticut suburb at a house with a long dining table and good candles. I remember it specifically because it was the first time I felt the gap between us as something real and unbridgeable, rather than something I could bridge with patience or effort. The conversation turned, the way dinner conversations sometimes do, toward relationships, toward what people wanted. A younger woman at the far end of the table said something unguarded and earnest about wanting a marriage that felt like a partnership, like two people who actually liked each other. There was a small ripple of agreement around the table. Qley smiled in a way that didn't reach. Later, in the car, she said, "Everyone was so basic tonight." I looked at her. She said, "Just be honest. Nobody actually just wants a nice partnership with someone they like. That's not ambition. That's giving up." I didn't argue. I just noted something settling inside me like sediment. I thought, I want exactly that. I want a partnership with someone I like. I thought that was the whole point. I didn't say it out loud, but I'd heard something. A quiet clarification. The beginning of an understanding I wasn't yet ready to complete. The final argument didn't start as an argument. It started as a conversation about the upcoming holiday, where we'd spend it, whose family, what the logistics looked like, the kind of conversation that couples have constantly, that becomes so routine it barely registers. But there was an edge underneath it from the start. Something tight. Something Qley had been carrying for days that I hadn't fully addressed. 2 weeks earlier, a colleague of mine named Kellen had been profiled in a trade publication. It was a niche thing, an industry newsletter that covered ops and consulting trends. Nothing major. But Kellen had texted me about it, and I'd mentioned it to Qley because I was genuinely happy for him. She'd Googled it. "He's good looking," she'd said. I said, "Yeah, Kellen's a good guy." She'd said, He photographs well. He looks the part." I said, "The part of what?" She'd said, "Of someone going somewhere." I'd let it go. I shouldn't have. So the night of the argument, we were talking about logistics, and then we were talking about Thanksgiving, and then somehow we were talking about a couple she'd run into that week, some acquaintance of hers who had apparently gotten engaged to someone she described as impressive. I didn't know the person, but I could hear what she was building toward. "He just has a presence," she said. "You walk into a room with him and people notice." I said, "That's good for them." She said, "Don't do that." I said, "Do what?" "That thing where you respond to what I say instead of what I mean." I put down whatever I was holding and looked at her properly. "Then say what you mean," I said. And she did. It came out in pieces. Not a monologue. More like a series of honest statements she'd been hoarding, finally deciding the accumulation was too heavy to keep carrying. She said she felt like our relationship had no energy, no arc, no momentum. She said she'd always imagined being with someone who created a certain effect, who drew attention when he walked in, who made women they knew think she's lucky. I wonder how she landed him. She said she didn't want to be with someone comfortable. She said she wanted someone exciting. She said, "I need someone who makes other women jealous, not someone who makes them comfortable." I heard it. I heard the whole shape of it. Not just the words but the years behind them. The rooftop watching that couple, the car rides home, the comments about Emery and Brooke and the woman at the dinner table who wanted a partnership, the question about Kellen photographing well. She wasn't criticizing my values. She was announcing that her values were different. She wanted a life that looked a specific way to a specific audience. I wanted a life that felt a specific way to the person I was building it with. These were not the same thing. They had never been the same thing. We had just managed to exist in the same space long enough that I'd mistaken proximity for alignment. I said something. I don't remember exactly what. Something quiet and accurate. Something about understanding what she was saying. About believing her. She waited for more. I didn't offer more. And then she was putting on her coat, the coat she'd come into the conversation already wearing. And she was saying something about needing space, needing time, and I stood there and I thought, she is leaving, and I am not going to stop her. The door closed with that soft, deliberate click. I sat down on the couch and I stayed there for a while. Not in grief. Not yet. In something more like stillness. The particular stillness that comes after you've heard the truth clearly, and the truth has turned out to be freeing rather than devastating. I had been trying to be what she needed for long enough that I'd stopped fully noticing what I actually was. And what I was, it turned out, was someone who valued exactly the things she had just told me she couldn't respect. That was information. Sad information. Clarifying information. The relationship ended the way it had been ending for a long time. Not with a fight. Not with betrayal. just with two people finally standing on either side of the truth they'd been avoiding, and one of them finally naming it out loud. She never came back for the drawer. I boxed it up after 2 weeks and left it with the building's front desk with her name on it. She picked it up on a Thursday afternoon while I was at work. I know this because my neighbor mentioned it. Not Qley. That detail also told me something. The months that followed were not cinematic. I want to be honest about this. There was no training montage. There was no obvious turning point. There was just the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding a daily life that had been organized around another person. I kept going to work. I started going to the gym more consistently, not to transform myself, just because it gave shape to mornings that had started to feel formless. I called Holden more. He'd come over sometimes on weekends, and we'd watch something and not talk about Qley, and that was exactly what I needed. I gave myself some time before I went back to the social events. About 6 weeks. Long enough that when I started showing up again, the slightly uncomfortable adjustment of "oh, so you two aren't together anymore" had already been processed by most people in the circle, and I didn't have to manage anyone else's feelings about it on top of my own. Kellen had become someone I genuinely leaned on during this period. We'd been friendly at work for a couple of years, but it deepened over those months. He had an uncomplicated way of talking about serious things, direct without being clinical, funny without being avoidant. He'd been through his own relationship that ended messily the year before, and he understood something about the particular quiet of the aftermath. He introduced me to Zane a couple months after the breakup. Zane was a former partner at a strategy consultancy who'd transitioned into advisory work and angel investing. Older than us by about 15 years, with the calm, considered presence of someone who'd already made most of the decisions I was still trying to think through. We started meeting for coffee occasionally. Informal mentorship that became actual conversation. He said something once that stayed with me. We were talking about work and momentum and the specific loneliness of figuring out what you actually want when you've spent a long time organizing your life around someone else's idea of it. He said, most people spend their 20s building for an audience. The lucky ones figure out before it's too late that the audience was never going to be satisfied anyway. I didn't say anything. He said, build something real. Something that makes sense to you. The right people will recognize it. I started working on the transition I'd been putting off. Moved into advisory work. Started building a client base on the side. Nothing dramatic, careful, methodical, the way I'd always done things. But it started to gain shape. Started to mean something. My life got smaller before it got better. That's the accurate version of events. Not smaller in a bad way. Smaller in the way a room feels smaller when you take the clutter out. Quieter, cleaner, more like something you actually chose. I was at a mutual friend's casual gathering, the kind where people bring wine and end up staying 3 hours longer than intended, when I first actually talked to Tegan. I'd seen her before, once or twice at similar things. The kind of face you register without quite filing. That night we ended up at the same end of a kitchen island while the rest of the group got louder in the other room. She was easy to talk to in the way that rare people are, not performing interest, just actually interested. She worked in urban planning and had a specificity about what she cared about that I found immediately disarming. We talked for about an hour, maybe longer. I drove home afterward thinking about her in the uncomplicated way you think about people who've made a good impression. Not romantic spiral, not projection. Just, she was good to talk to. I texted Holden about it the next day. He said, finally. I said, it was one conversation. He said, sure. Tegan and I moved slowly. This was partly circumstance and partly something we both seemed to understand without discussing, that neither of us was interested in the performance of a relationship. We weren't interested in the accelerated version. We wanted to actually know each other. We got coffee, then dinner a week later, then a Saturday afternoon that was supposed to be a museum and turned into walking through 4 neighborhoods and talking about things I hadn't talked about in years. What I'd wanted to be when I was 12, how I thought about risk, what I found genuinely funny, what kept me up at night. She told me things too. About her family's particular brand of chaos. About a project she was working on that she was proud of. About a friendship that had quietly ended in her mid-20s and the way that loss had taken longer to process than she'd expected. We were honest with each other early. Not in an oversharing way. In the way that some people are simply calibrated toward truth, and you can feel it in how they talk. She didn't seem interested in what our relationship looked like from the outside. She seemed interested in what it actually was. The difference was not subtle. I noticed, somewhere around month 2, that I was not editing myself around her. Not performing steadiness or ambition or a version of competence calibrated to what I thought she wanted to see. I was just present, showing up as whatever I actually was that day. And she seemed to like whatever that was. I thought about Qley sometimes, not with anger, with something closer to the sensation you get when you look at an old photograph. Recognition without feeling, a little distance, a small acknowledgement that you were once there. I thought about what she'd said. I need someone who makes other women jealous. And I thought, Tegan would never say something like that. Not because she was incapable of vanity, but because the sentence itself would not make sense to her. The audience was not the point. The audience was never the point. I also thought about Emery and Brooke and the woman at the dinner table who had said simply that she wanted a partnership, someone she liked. And I thought, they weren't basic. They were right. The things Qley had dismissed as settling were not settling. They were the whole thing. Tegan and I had been together about 7 months when I started thinking seriously about the future. Not anxiously. The way you think about something that's already becoming clear that you're just waiting to give language to. I talked to Holden about it. He asked me how I knew. I said, I've never had to remind myself to be patient with her. It doesn't cost me anything. He said, that's it. That's the whole answer. I talked to Zane about it. He said less, but smiled in a way that communicated something complete. I spent 3 weeks thinking about the proposal, not the aesthetics of it. I knew Tegan well enough to know she'd find anything elaborate slightly absurd, but the honesty of it. What I actually wanted to say? What I wanted to mean. I took her to Connecticut on a Saturday in late spring, to a small town on the shoreline that she'd mentioned once, offhandedly, as a place she'd gone with her family as a kid and still thought about. We walked by the water. We got food from somewhere casual and ate on a bench. And then I said the things I'd been thinking. About knowing her. About what I wanted. About the specific quality of life with her that had made me understand, finally, what the whole point was. She said yes before I'd fully finished. And then she laughed at herself for interrupting, and I laughed too. And we stayed by the water for a long time after. We didn't do an elaborate photo shoot. A friend had a good camera and took some pictures at a dinner gathering a few weeks later. Easy, unposed, the kind of photos where people look like themselves. Tegan in a blue dress laughing at something Holden said. The two of us at the table, close together, her ring visible only if you were looking for it. Someone posted them. Then someone else shared them. Then Emery shared them and wrote something warm underneath about love that looks like home. Then Brooke shared them with something similar. Then more people. Women from the overlapping social circles. People I knew and some I barely did. Comment after comment in that easy, genuine register that happens when something actually resonates with people. Not the performative congratulations of obligation, but the real response that something good produces in people who still believe in good things. This is everything. They are perfect together. This is what it's supposed to look like. So happy for both of you. I saw some of them. Tegan sent me screenshots with laughing faces next to the sweet ones. Holden sent me one from Emery with a note that said simply, she gets it. The women Qley had quietly mocked for their ordinary happiness. The ones she'd called basic, the ones she'd suggested had settled, the ones she'd implied were not ambitious enough for what the world offered. They were the ones celebrating most genuinely. They recognized something, I think. Not me specifically. The shape of the thing. The kind of relationship that looked, from the outside, like exactly what it felt like from the inside. I didn't know, for several weeks, that Qley had seen any of it. What I know came later, through the kind of second and third-hand information that moves through social circles whether you want it to or not. Emery mentioned it to someone, who mentioned it to Holden, who told me in the casual way he relayed things he thought I should know but had no particular feelings about. Qley had been scrolling, not following anyone who'd posted. She'd been too careful for that. But the way social media works, the shares and the comments and the friend-of-friend visibility meant that it had found its way to her screen anyway. Photo after photo. Comment after comment. The same women she had once characterized as content, as basic, as people who'd stopped reaching for more. Those women, writing about how right this looked, how much they wished us happiness. I don't know exactly what she thought. I don't have access to that. But I can guess, because I knew her well, and I knew the particular quality of her attention when something disrupted a story she'd been telling herself. She'd been telling herself, probably, that I was someone she'd outgrown, that she'd been right to go, that the life she wanted required someone with different qualities than I had, and she was out there finding it. And then here was this cascade of evidence suggesting a different reading, that the life I'd built hadn't stalled, that the person I was, the one she'd called comfortable, the one she'd contrasted with the kind of man who generates envy, had found someone for whom that person was exactly right. and that the finding of it had produced a kind of genuine happiness that read differently than the curated excitement she'd been chasing. I received a message from her about 6 weeks after the engagement. It was short, respectful, the kind of message that takes someone a long time to write and probably several drafts to get to something simple enough to send. She said, "I heard the news. I'm happy for you. You deserve this." She said, "I've been thinking a lot. I think I misunderstood some things." That was all. No ask, no angle, no invitation to respond with something that reopened anything. I read it twice. I didn't feel anger. I want to be specific about this because I think people expect anger in this moment, and I understand why, but it wasn't there. Not satisfaction either. I've read enough stories like this to know that satisfaction means you were still invested in the other person's perception of you, and I wasn't. What I felt was something quieter, something that sat in the chest without pressing. Acknowledgement, maybe. Recognition that someone had arrived at an honest place, alone, and had found enough grace to send a few simple sentences. I wrote back. 3 sentences. I thanked her for saying so. I said I hoped she was well. I meant it. That was the end. Tegan was in the other room when I sent it. She was on a call, gesturing at something on her laptop, smiling at whatever was being said. I watched her for a moment through the doorway. I thought about what Qley had wanted. The kind of man who walks into a room and makes women envious. The kind of relationship that reads a specific way to a specific audience. The life that performs itself. And then I looked at Tegan in the other room, fully herself, fully present, not managing an image or calculating a perception, just living in the life we were actually building. I thought, I hope Qley finds what she's looking for. I mean that without irony, without edge. The wanting of it doesn't go away just because you've redirected it somewhere more honest, and she deserves to end up in a place that's genuinely hers, not just the version she thinks she's supposed to want. But I also thought, the women she wanted to impress ended up celebrating the life she walked away from. I closed my phone. I went into the other room. Tegan looked up from her laptop and made a face that meant 5 more minutes and pointed at the phone, and I nodded and sat down across from her and waited. And it wasn't exciting. It wasn't the kind of thing that photographs particularly well. It was just Tuesday in an apartment in Queens with someone I'd chosen and who had chosen me, and outside, somewhere, a feed was still filling with comments from women who understood exactly what they were looking at. That was enough. That was, it turned out, the whole thing.